Hello everyone, my name is Celine and I'd like to talk to you today about map design. I'm going to be showing you some mistakes that I made in the past that can horribly drag down the quality of your cartography. I want to start off by showing you a map that I made when I was just getting started with GIS. This was for a university assignment for which we had to create a touristic map of the Isle of Arran up here in Scotland. And at first glance, it doesn't look so bad. I was actually quite pleased with myself when I handed this in, and very disappointed to receive a mediocre grade for it. I didn't understand why. But now, about 3 years later, I look at it again with slightly more knowledge, and it's much easier to see what's gone wrong. So, just to point out a few things. A lot of the labels and symbols are hard to read because there's not a lot of color contrast, such as, for example, in the blue of the sea and the purple of the place names, or in the gray-brown mush of colors here in the Goatfell region. The contour lines are placed on top of the roads and rivers, which is illogical ordering. I'm not sure what's happening with this patch of forest in the top corner, and you might have noticed that there is no legend, so we can only guess what everything means. All in all, plenty of reason for a remake. I'm going to recreate this map, overcoming these pitfalls, and whilst we're at it, giving you some tips on how to really accelerate your map making in ArcGIS Pro. This is a list of layers and map elements that I had access to when I first made the map, and fortunately I still have the same shapefiles. You've got point, line, and polygon data for things like tourist attractions, roads, the island itself, and also a DTM raster layer, which I made into hillshade. And what I clearly did is open all of them at once and try and make them work together as well as possible. It's difficult to create coherence between so many components when there's no established hierarchy as to what's most and least important for people to see when they first read your map. And that's ultimately where this one failed because everything has the same visual weight, if you like. You don't really know where to focus your attention because everything's equally aggressively eye-catching. So to avoid this, what I do nowadays is categorize all map components into one of three stages of my typical cartography workflow: background, foreground, and then layout. And anything that doesn't contribute to one of these three groups is redundant and it's not going to get included in the final visual. The background consists of all the layers that set the scene, whereas the foreground is made up of layers that carry the message of your map, which is in this case touristic points and places of interest on the Isle of Arran. And the layout includes all the non-geographic elements that are added in last. And I also find it really helpful to decide in advance how important every map element or layer is relative to others within each workflow category. By considering what your audience should look at first and second and last, you've created a visual hierarchy, and that's going to function as a reference guide throughout the process of making our map. Now here we are in ArcGIS Pro, getting started with creating that background. And we only want to display those layers that actually contribute to setting the scene. Now your base map is by default part of your background. And you can actually customize your base map in a web browser tool called the Vector Tile Style Editor. And here you can completely personalize the color scheme of everything that makes up a base map and also decide to leave out elements entirely. So in this instance, I'm going to strip it of all the text because that's going to make it too visually cluttered for this map's purpose, and I want it to look clean. And what led to issues with my initial Arran map was poor color contrast between different layers. So there's a need for creating a wider range of bland to strong colors. And this starts with your color choices in the base map, which typically you want to be setting to lighter tones so you can go over them later with stronger colors for the foreground layers. But this is not a set in stone rule, and I'm actually choosing a relatively dark shade of blue for the water because I know that I'm later going to go over it with white text, which is more of a personal preference, but more on that later. Bottom line is that you need to make sure that there's a spectrum of color brightnesses that you can choose from. And once you're done, you can save your customized base map as a vector tile layer into your ArcGIS Online space, and from there you can access it in Pro. I also want to include the Living Atlas multi-directional hillshade layer, which already looks better than creating hillshade from a DTM manually. This right away is going to add more depth and make the map look more dramatic, basically. And what you can do is just adjust its transparency, but this actually makes the map as a whole a darker shade than what we intended when we were building that base map. So we will also want to use the layer blending tool. We're going to multiply the hillshade with the base map, and what this does is essentially only conserve the stronger pixels of the hillshade and erase that grayscale. So layer blending is a go-to for hillshade, but also, for example, when you want to blend your vector features with imagery, because this can give your map more of an earth surface aesthetic. Now, for the rivers and forests, all I'm changing is tinting their colors to something that's more bland. And I've also removed that tree pattern from the forests because that just creates unnecessary noise. So like I said, it helps me to determine what layers should be prioritized over others in terms of drawing the audience's attention. And as for the background layer, the Isle of Arran waterline is obviously more important than the polygon that we have of the mainland. So what I'm doing is de-emphasizing the mainland by filling that polygon with the same color as the water, blue, but making it transparent because I still want people to be able to see the rough terrain just for reference. Now, for the Arran waterline, to really bring it forward, we can put a shadow behind it by going into the Properties tab of the Symbology window. And then under Structure, you want to add an extra stroke layer, which you then have to set to a white to black gradient stroke. And make sure to set the white to 100% transparency and the black to about 80%. And the cap type has to be set to but. And then you can also experiment with the size of the shadow by adjusting the width of the stroke. And there you have it. We've just set the scene of the Isle of Arran map with a background. Earlier, we concluded that these are the layers that should be at the foreground of the map because they carry the message of important touristic places on Arran. So from most to least important, we have attractions, towns, mountain peaks, and ferry routes, which is still quite a lot to balance. And as we saw before, I really struggled to make the labels and icons readable. They kind of just disappeared into the intenseness of it all. So we need to work on that. Starting with icons of tourist attractions, I'm going to make them a little bit bigger and also make sure that they have a white circle behind them, which first of all kind of standardizes them into the same information type and also just makes them easier to spot. I'm giving all of my point data, so the attractions, the net mountain peaks, and the towns, that same shadow effect as I did on the polygon of Arran, just to make it look like they again hover above the island itself. Now for place names, positioning them half on top of the land and half on top of the water is quite hectic looking. So what we can do instead is utilize the geography of this location and configure it so that all the labels are placed outside of the parameter of Arran. And the way to accomplish this is by assuring that you have your label weighting set effectively. And in this label weight ranking window, I'm indicating the labels can't overlap with any features on land. So the weights are essentially creating blocks that maneuver the labels into more favorable positions. And as for their text, I went with white letters on top of a slightly stronger blue, but you could also reverse it and have a very, very light blue sea with a dark text font. You just need to ensure that there's that contrast because we want the labels to stand out. And funny enough, that's exactly what I'm going to try and avoid for the fairy lines, choosing a sort of in-between tint of blue. And the whole reason behind this is that I want the audience's initial focus not to be stolen away by the fairy routes, but rather have them start their gaze in the center of the map and work their way outward to other bits and pieces of information that the map has to offer, such as the fairy routes. In my original map, I used a yellow to red color gradient to symbolize the size of roads on Arran, which is not too inappropriate for road data, but in this map piece, it just adds to the strong colors, which there were already a lot of. So we just need to tone that down a little bit. And it can be quite tricky to decide what the best way is to visualize variation across a data set. So in this case, small paths to large roads, whilst also maintaining a pleasant overall aesthetic. And a power move here is to take a look at one of these classic matrices of some symbolization methods within cartography. And we see that besides color, you can actually also use size or shape of features to distinguish between their values. So instead of intensifying the color, I'm going to adjust the line fill and thickness. And you might notice that in my symbology gallery, I've actually got a whole lot of icons and things that you don't come across in standard ArcGIS Pro, if you will. And that's because I've imported additional style files, such as these lines for the roads. You can create your own styles, or maybe your organization has already done it for branding and consistency and standardization of your maps, which is in essence the purpose of styles. However, some people have created some really nice ones for public use that are more on the creative cartography side. And the absolute hero of style files is John Nelson. So if you search him on your ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise and find a style file that you fancy, all you need to do is download it. And once you've done that, back in ArcGIS Pro, you navigate to the Insert ribbon, and under Styles, click on Import, and then find it on your machine. And then that adds it to your symbology gallery to use on any vector features. So that's another trick to really easily expand your symbology options. Now I'm going to start taking this into the layout view, and here we can make our ArcGIS project file into a static final visual, which is a bit old school, so end it here if you only make interactive web maps, but there are some really nice finishing touches that you can make in the layout view. What made me cringe really hard about my old map was the imbalanced positioning of the island within the map frame. Since this map is about Aaron, let's place it right in the center. And same for the title, we want it to be right in the middle, same amount of spacing on the left as on the right, and same amount of spacing to the top of the page as down to the north side of the island. In terms of arranging the layout elements to show their order of importance, the title should probably be first noticed. So that's why we're making it big and white. But you can't have a map without a north arrow and a scale bar because they contextualize your area. Although they are the bottom feeders in terms of visual hierarchy, I think. So we're going to choose colors that are going to chameleon them more into the background. And my personal preference is to have the north arrow in one of the top corners and the scale bar somewhere down at the bottom. The legend can't be overlooked quite this much, so we're using a relatively large font size and white color for that strong contrast with the background. I could also add more to this, such as what the different roads mean, but anything that kind of speaks for itself, I prefer to leave out, although this does depend on the map purpose. Sometimes you just need a lengthy legend. It's also not always possible to have all of your layout elements float over the map frame, which does look very smooth. But sometimes you just have too many items in your legend, or there just seems to not be enough space to fit it all in. So what I find a good way to make this judgment call is by zooming out slightly on your map frame's extent, and then just eyeballing whether there's enough open space surrounding your area or features of interest. So enough open space so that you can place things uh, on top on the side of it without it looking disturbing to any of your features or areas of interest. So when you have an ocean nearby, it almost always works. And what you can then finally do is put a little decorative frame around the edges to pull it all together. And here we have the final result. If we put it next to my original design, I think it's a world of improvement. And whilst we look at this, I'd like to summarize some of the lessons that I got out of going back and remaking this map. First and foremost is to plan your cartography in the background foreground layout workflow to guide you through it. Rank the layers and map elements in every stage of this workflow so you know what bits need to stand out more and which ones fall into a lower priority for the audience to notice. Customize your base map and import style files to expand your options. Place shadows behind features of interest and use layer blending and transparency to create depth. Use label weightings to avoid chaotic overlaps. Symbolize not only by color ranges, but also size and shape variations, whatever contributes the most to the overall composition. Apply a low color contrast to de-emphasize features and a strong color contrast to highlight features. And finally, don't be afraid to experiment with different techniques, but make sure to map with a visual hierarchy in mind. So those are my takeaways from this, and I hope they resonate with you as well now that we've had a look at both an example of poor and good incorporation of these principles into our map making. Thank you very much for listening.